The thinking dialogue today is titled Imagination in Emergency, and it's for creative theories and agency when history is a catastrophe. We're asking, what is the role of creative practices related to legacies of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid in October 2024, where violence across the world reminds us that political thought is a necessary part of entangled everyday lives. These thinking dialogues are curated to energize the work of continuing to imagine the new, contest ideas of newness, and think in collective dialogue to transgress borders of the imagination. The interdisciplinary conversations that we are having seek to see public intellectuals thinking in the moment of gathering and thinking through art taken seriously. So these practice-led discussions seek to work with notions of creative theorization, as Professor Pumla Gqola conceives and continues to unpack in her important work on African feminist theorization. The imagined new thinking dialogues here are online rooms connecting us beyond borders on the ground and beyond mental borders. And so we consider this an undisciplined venue, a venue seeking to facilitate a generous and generative space that goes into what dialogue is about productive exchanges, meetings, and possibly future collaborations. So I am very happy to introduce Ayman AlAzraq, who is a Palestinian artist who makes films, photos, and mixed media work using everyday experiences as a starting point. Ayman's work responds directly to the surrounding environment, and these are often framed instances that would usually go unnoticed in their original context. And I'm also introducing myself today because I'm joining the discussion in a different way to yesterday. So again, I am Nondumiso Lwazi Msimanga, and as a co-panelist today, I'm going to introduce myself as a performance artist and provocateur, somebody who works at the intersections of the paradoxical. I tend to ask questions with messy answers, and I attend to life as both an artist and a cultural critic. We're going to start with Ayman introducing his work to us. And the work we're specifically going to be focusing on today is The Lost Tapes of a People's Tribunal, 1982. Ayman, if you would do us the honor of opening.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. This project, it's very long research-based project, which is started almost around like 15 years back when I was a student at the Art Academy of Oslo, and then I was living in a student house where I went to the basement, and then I found like many images on the floor. Uh, and I just like kind of like get interested just to look at the images and see, what's this kind of images. So I went to this like room and then I start looking to the images and then I found it's all from Palestine. So I get into more and then I collect everything and I just run to my room and I hide there. I just want to make the story short, to not because it's very long story. And then since that I get interested in this like yeah, then I start like asking myself why or how, like why I find these images like in this place, like why, who was living here, like there is someone was like from Palestine, there is something like what's going on here. So I start asking in Oslo like about these images, and then someone told me that a group called Palestina Komiteen, which is the Palestinian or like the solidarity movement from Norway, had an office there. And then when they moved, they just left their own archive. But then I start like contacting them, and then I get interested more into this story of solidarity. And this group of like working with Palestine since like almost like in the beginning of 60s until today, and what they did during that time. And like you go and meet people and talk to them, and everyone you meet, like you have a different stories and different things, but also like they kept giving me more materials. Like, you go and sit with like guys, and like, yeah, I was like worked in Lebanon during the 82. And then like here is like some images or like some photos so that you can have them. And then one day I went and I had a meeting with the guys, and we were talking about like what's happening in Beirut during the 82, and he was a doctor, you know, like all these kind of things. And then he told me, you know, like we have these 5 VHS tapes, and it's all for you. You just take them and do whatever you like with them. I said, like, but what's this VHS tapes? Like, what's inside this VHS tapes? And he said, like, you know, like during the 82, after the war, the Palestina Committee or the Palestina Front at that time decided to do like a hearing, and then they invited everyone or like most of people worked during the wartime from like June till September to come to Oslo to give their witness. And they made it look like a court in a way where like they have like kind of a jury, like from like people who work with law or international law or like, you know, a professor like in the University of Law. So they invited all of them to sit, and then like people like they come and they enter to the stage and they just give their own witness about what they saw, but also they need to document that with like documentation, like they need to give them like all the like the paper that they wrote, all the documentation so they have, so the doctors comes and say like, you know what, this is what's happened. And all these materials he just like came to me and said like just take them. And then since that I was thinking about like how to do an exhibition which is talking about like something like it's about war, you know, like it's something like really heavy. It's nothing like you can do it, but you need to tell the story of these people, like you need. And also like the idea of like this leftover and forgetting in this like basement, it's kind of like also like felt like, you know, it's strange like how that's like, you know, how this history can be uh forgotten somewhere and nobody kind of know anything about it, you know, like so I did work with a place called Photo Gallery. It's a small exhibition here in Oslo, and then we decided to go for like the lost tape, and that is just like for this hearing. I mean, the main exhibition it's about it, where we focus on like me telling the story of the like how I find the archive. This is part of the exhibition. Some of the images for the doctor, the Norwegian doctors inside like the camps and that, and then like, you know, like Mahmoud Darwish is the famous Palestinian poem. He was inside or like he was like part of this hearing, and he gave like a really nice speech, very like great speech about the idea. And he also talked about this idea of like how to become like, you know, like the like any tragic have like 4 elements to become a tragic. And then like you need to have like the murders, and you have to victims, and you need to have the judge, and then you need to have the witness. And for us as a Palestinians, we are the victim, but all sometimes they use us as a witness for this case. And then like this idea was very strong. So yeah, so I tried to do, I did this exhibition where I focused on like many different elements in it, where like the like as you see this like red boxes is tell the story as it's all like negative images where you can go and see like people working and living in the camp in the daily life. And then you go to the other room where you find all the documentation of the hearing, where like, you know, like the map of Sabra Shatila and the map of Beirut. And then the second room where you see the video. And then like this room, the orange one or the red one, it's Mahmoud Darwish's speech. And then the other like the like there is another room where like another 2 Norwegian doctors also they have a story, and then they were arrested during the war and like talked, yeah, being arrested by the Israeli and took them from like Lebanon to Israel and from there back to Lebanon, and they have like a very long story on that. So that's like make it like very short, not getting into all details of the exhibition. Yeah.
Ayman, thank you for that background to what I think is an incredible work on archives and something that asks the question, that decolonization is constantly asking about archives. Why was this archive not kept somewhere, stored, conserved, protected, exhibited, made available? Why was this archive just laying in a room somewhere, forgotten?
This is like, it's a bigger questions. And then, like there is many, I mean, one of it is like Palestina Committee. It's a very small organization, which is they don't have the resource to do the work of archiving. But that's one part of it. The second part of it, which is basically I mean, the museum and like the National Library, it's a tool of the colonization itself. And then you don't find these kind of things. I mean, you find things related to Palestine, that the region. I mean, like there was the festivals, and then they screen like Palestinian films, so you could see that. But this work, you don't find it like in the National Museum. You don't find it in the National Library. It's kind of like left somewhere else. And then there is one place in Oslo, which is called the Worker Union, which is have a good relation to Palestine. So they have part of the archive. But this archive, it's kind of like also kind of like putting in a place where it's difficult to get into the place itself, like very kind of like very hard like building, and it's very kind of like it's not easy to enter, and then you need to go from a floor to another floor, and then there is someone need to take you from the door and up to the I don't know where, and then you get into these small offices, and then you need to tell them what you need, and then they look at it like so like, and then like, yeah, here is the things that you have. So I think it's part of like how like they want to tell the story. Like they don't want to tell the real story of what's happening in Palestine or in other places. They want to tell their own story about what they know about Palestine or like other like places. So, and I think it's interesting, like also the question of imagine like yourself in a museum nowadays, and then like also like like this project I started, as I said, long time before what's happening 7th of October. And then when I did it, it was like immediately after 7th of October, like in December. So like was really hard time. And it was like really hard time for me, even working with this like very heavy materials. And then like, the discussion, it's become different in a way, like when like all the Museum of Norway kind of like come with a statement of they are not engaging with like, or they are not part of like political discussion, or they don't want to get engaged in these kind of questions, because like they just showing art is not part of like the museum discourse, or like not part of the, and then like kind of like you start looking at it in a different way. It's just like, yeah, I mean, you don't need to give them this archive. I mean, this archive owned by Norwegian and Palestinian people, and then it's need to be like open publicly, and then like we could use it and do like an exhibition, do like a lectures, do whatever we like to do if we put it there. So we just like kind of like bury it in another like storage, like in the National Museum or National Library. And then like like maybe I'm interested on that, like, and he want to make a research, so he go there and look at it. But yeah, I thought like this is like my project now, how to make it like available, how to make it like public, like it's open to everyone, because it's not my archive. I did work with it, but it's for everyone. So like how, and here is the question comes, like like to deal with the museum and art institution, where they just like kind of like make it, they want to make it like more complicated than it should be, which is basically it's like it's an archive for people, they can just have a look at it, and that's it.
So, Ayman, I want to pause and introduce Professor Pumla Dineo, who has been able to join us after an emergency. And I want to say thank you very, very much for joining us during an emergency to talk about imagination in emergency. It was not supposed to be that ironic, but thank you for being able to join us. And I would like to just quickly share that Professor Gqola is a South African academic, writer, and gender activist with numerous accolades for her creative nonfiction works. She is a professor of literature at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, where she works as the South African chair in African feminist imaginations, a title that I find extremely generative. Professor Pumla Dineo Gqola, we're going to let you arrive, and I will respond with my opening in relation to Ayman's work and in relation to the thinking dialogue that we had yesterday as well. And I want to say thank you very much to Surafo Abebe, who has written in our question and answer box saying this conversation resonates with yesterday's very well. What do we hear in a museum? Museum as cemetery, devoid of an act of mourning. And I think that what you've just spoken about is exactly what's prompted Surafo Abebe's response. This idea that the official museums, the official spaces of archives make things more difficult than is necessary and want to remove the politics from the work. And so the act of mourning, the work of mourning that this archive allows to be possible, the work of remembering and solidarity that this archive makes possible, the work of thinking about Norwegians and their solidarity movement with Palestine in 1982 is made impossible by all of the red tape that gets put in place. And so to make it accessible, I think is also a creative act that I'm interested in knowing about how you find your way into doing that, what accessibility might mean. So I'd like to go from there and reflect a little bit about yesterday's conversation and reflect toward today's conversation, because this is what the thinking dialogues are about us continuing to activate our thinking spaces and our creative capacities to think during emergency. So yesterday, Professor Françoise Vergès spoke of a pedagogy of unlearning. Knowing through dialogue is something that feels for me is around the terms by which art asks us to know the world. So I've been thinking about how art asks us to know the world and how art demands that we continue asking to know the world during times of emergency and continuous catastrophe. So today I sit with the words wait, like this archive that Ayman is describing as heavy. I sit with the word light. I sit with diffraction and suspension, knowing the world through crawling, as we'll experience in Noor Abed's work, knowing the world through living, otherwise, as we'll experience through Gerald Machona's work, finding ways of knowing in the otherwise places, in the otherwise ways, knowing through peeling atmospheres with the voice, knowing through listening, knowing through story, and not taking this for granted, knowing how we know through stories that were not meant to survive, knowing by collective participation, knowing by witnessing, knowing through testimony, or knowing through creating economies of freedom, economies of justice, economies of possibility. And I think about these kinds of economies from yesterday's conversation. And today, I remember that Professor Gqola speaks about the economy of the female fear factory and how this economy tells us that fear is normal, how this economy has normalized experiences of having to be frozen constantly, experiences that tell you to be frozen in times of fear, and how we need to know differently these different kinds of fear factories. Professor Gqola describes the female fear factory in this way. The female fear factory, which I also call the manufacture of female fear, relies on quick, effective transfer of meaning. To normalize depends on a combination of seemingly contradictory processes, a frequent repetition of performance until the performance becomes invisible. I think about the kinds of normalized performances, the kinds of acts that don't look like acts anymore, and how artistic ways of knowing ask us to look again, to close our eyes and listen again, to feel again, to taste, to know differently, especially when the world doesn't care to know, is too tired to care, or when words are censored and pain is negated. Artistic knowing is continuing to look for other ways of knowing why, how, what, who, where, when, and other ways to deal with the no way. No way are we living in an emergency again. What Ayman AlAzraq's work does is remind us that in 1982, Palestine experienced a siege. And at different points in time, Palestine has experienced being under attack. But what it also does is remind us that in different pockets of the world, in Norway, in Oslo, there was a solidarity committee that decided to perform a trial when no trial was taking place on the world stage. And this kind of creative act of solidarity has found its way into survival because it was documented, it was archived, even though the archives were then abandoned. And artistic ways of knowing want to know what happened there. How did that archive that was so important, that every single one of those creative testimonies in the performance of a trial, how were they abandoned when there's 14 hours that's been found by an artist years later? So yesterday's thinking dialogue made freedom a feeling I can feel, otherwise of the utter exhaustion of having to drag my body through difficult periods. I think of Omolora Ogundipe, who says that women carry 6 mountains on their back. She speaks specifically from an African feminist perspective. And I think about how many mountains Palestinian women are carrying, how many mountains Sudanese women have to carry, how many mountains Congolese women are carrying. And how do we know about that experience when the world is suppressing those experiences? How do we know about those experiences when we can't be in those bodies? What does it mean to reconsider solidarity and think about what this tribunal in 1982 offers us for other ways of knowing, for artistic and creative ways to imagine a world where justice can be possible for those who cannot experience justice right now. And so art asks us to ask about weight and not just be weighed down, but to transgress the experience of the world by trying to know about it. And somehow that very task is how art asks us to think about living. How do we live pedagogies of unknowing? How do we charge ourselves with the critical creative uncertainty that artistic knowing demands of us? How do we do that when we have to contend with feeling different kinds of weight from moving with 6 mountains or more on our backs? And what does rest mean through artistic terms? I also want to invite a sense of the proximity that Ayman's work makes possible, that in hearing these testimonies, we're able to hear about how people in Norway, visited Lebanon and stayed there for months, working as doctors, as nurses, as untrained health assistants, to be in solidarity. And art then asks for my closeness. And this disrupts that constant barrage of more war news that makes scenes of war so numbing and so sensational and so removed that somebody's work, like Bisan, who has just been given an Emmy Award, can be satiated by receiving an accolade, which might also at the same time be bringing Bisan's work into the public that is not listening. But how do we work against being satiated of the need to say well done to those who are activists and not participate? How does art ask us to not become museums of the mass accumulation of scenes of violence? Art asks me to imagine I am a museum and to attend to whatever I have in my echo chamber. Artistic knowing helps me sit with the frequencies of complacent complicity in me. If my body is a museum, it is cannibalistic, it is a co-conspirator, it is colonialist. And I've accumulated, eaten body parts greedily, becoming wanting of the loot of horror. Nakba has become pieces of skulls and steatophagus jars swimming in formaldehyde inside me. And I've lost connection with what solidarity means because I'm housing such a vast accumulation of images of death that I need to cleanse myself to disrupt the musification of what my body sees. And Françoise yesterday called a museum a place of death and one that negates death. And so it makes mourning impossible work. And so today I'm inviting us to ask about what art is asking us. And this is directly from the conversation that I had with Professor Gqola, where you reminded me about Gqola, the curator, saying we have to ask about the question that art asks. And I'm paraphrasing, so I might have it wrong. But I've sat with the question that art asks us to ask, and the sense that that question is not necessarily one to be answered finitely, but that doing that work is what makes solidarity in a new way possible right now, and that we need to do that. And so, Ayman, I'd like to invite you to offer us some questions that doing your work and trying to figure out how to curate this archive has given you. One of the questions that you asked earlier is about how to make it accessible so people can use it. What other questions has having to curate this work given you?
No, like when I found the archive, I start like my interest was like to find more about the solidarity movement and to understand why they were interested in Palestine or the case of Palestine specifically. And then like you get to know, I mean, also this is like maybe we can talk about it. The idea of solidarity was completely different than what we know today. This is also like something because those worked with Palestine. I mean, all of them, they had something to do with South Africa struggles. They all of them know what's happening in Vietnam. So all of them, they had something to do with Algeria. So like the idea was bigger than just like to do a small solidarity works. But for like the last step, it was the idea how that possible that a group of like people, which is its normal people, kind of gathering to find the truth outside of the law house or like the courthouse or like the where it should be there, like with where like we should like put this case in it, like which is the court or like. So like how is that possible that this kind of a group comes together and just like try to do these works where the law itself, it's kind of like forget it. And here is like Mahmoud Darwish with this idea is just like, kind of like talking to each other, this like four element, like the murders and the victims and the witness and the judge. And like how become like, like when he talked about like as a Palestinian, we are the victim of the victims. And the judge is the one who started the whole things, like so like and the question like how to talk to the judge that who create the whole like kind of the whole problems or like the whole issue now. So like I started from there. So like I start to ask all these kind of a question to kind of structure this exhibition in a way, kind of tell the story from like those Norwegian doctors. Most of them, they were doctors and nurses and went to these like camps and just like sit there and just witness. And this is idea is not an easy to do, like to leave the country, which is peacefully, and just to sit in a camp for like almost 3 months under the war time, which is you might be killed like as a Palestinians, and to leave everything and just to for believe, like that you're believing in this case. And then just to go through that in this exhibition. So like basically you kind of like go through the courtroom in a way, like where you kind of like first you kind of to get introduced to the story of the archive, introduce the story of the camp, and then like you get into more detailed like happen in this hearing, which is it's a bit long and like like to go more into to different stories inside the exhibition in a way. But also like like there is many questions when it comes to the archive itself, how people kind of deal with that sometimes, which especially in Europe, like like I mean this archive is talking about this. I mean like the idea of solidarity, it's there, it's all the time, it's like present in the knowledge of European especially, and like they want to help, they want to do solidarity, but in a different way. I think I don't want to be like the one that will criticize it too much, but it's kind of like when it's come to the truth, so they kind of like take it away and then they focus on the way how they did it, like on the like like we did help and that's it and that's enough. So like there is something about like this archive being not hidden but like not accepted in the National Library, in the National Museum. It just left over, nobody kind of like like take care of it, and it's been like there hidden in this way. But also like as you said, like then like I was thinking, asking myself a question like like why the museum want to have these works. I mean like museum like almost like need to talk about something which is done and finished, and then like they talk about it after like I don't know how many years that like this has happened in the history, and then we preserve it and we kind of like showing how we are nice, like we preserve like this archive like the others.
Yeah. Thank you, Ayman. I think that's a really important place to come to you, Pumla. I want to just remind us all that we're thinking in dialogue today about imagination in emergency for creative theories and agencies when history is a catastrophe, and that what you've just said as well, Ayman, around museum, and I think this kind of feeling of museumification of being able to take in things that are happening, that continue to happen, and to relegate them to the past and to make them into objects that are not living, that are not now going through this thing continuing, and to be able to then take that history and say, it is over. Apartheid happened, now it is done, and now we can have a museum because it is finished. And war happened, and now it is done, and we are finished with that. And so this archive can't be put into a museum because this is
No,
ongoing, because Palestine asks us this question of how to deal with apartheid that is ongoing, with
no,
colonization
I just want to
is
add.
ongoing.
I want to add
Yes.
like one small things about it, which is it's very interesting when you look at the archive and as I said, like like I did it before 7th of October, and like 7th of October happened, and then if you look at the rhetoric that was used, like during that time, it's completely the same. I mean, even how the media, like the Western media, cover like the war at that time, it's almost like it's impossible to find it almost like the same exactly. Like there is no change at all. And I found it like very interesting, like like how is that possible? Like you just keep treating the people like like this has happened like 40 years back, and you still like kind of like tell the same narrative time and time over without like even thinking that I mean like without even thinking about the others, like they listening and they hearing. It's kind of like making you also like think more about it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. And so, Prof. Gqola, I'd like to invite you to share your opening with us, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Nondumiso, and thank you, Ayman. Thank you for inviting me, and my apologies again for stepping into the conversation late and missing the very beginning of Ayman's slideshow and presentation. So thinking about how I would begin my participation in this conversation, I think it might make sense to say a little bit about my thinking around imagination, my own work, the work of the imagination and the relationship and what I think the imagination does in relation to time and memory. And so in many ways, I think part of the conversation that's already begun, excuse me, today can speak a little bit about that. But perhaps what I'll do then is I'll give a little bit of background to some of the intersections of my work. So as Nondumiso says, by training I'm a literary scholar, and my work has been concerned with two forms of things. The first one is the work of the imagination, which I think as a literary scholar, there's certain assumptions about what imaginative language does and enables that I kind of inherit. I'm also a writer, and so I'm very mindful of the work of how different works of the imagination are languaged and the place of language in that. My work is also, of course, very, very, I think in another life, I may be a historian, because I'm perpetually haunted and energized by long histories of violence and long histories of pursuing freedom across various epochs. And so some of my work has been on thinking about the ways in which slavery, colonialism, apartheid, so what someone else has called the long chaotic nightmare, continue to, rather than being over, continue to produce forms of knowledge, forms of possibility, forms of violence that have become commonplace, that we take for granted. And so in many ways, then the project that I invest in, both inside and outside the academy, is one that contests this overness of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. To be clear, I do not mean that nothing has changed. However, I think that it is important. I do not really think that we live in slavery in the same way that someone living in South Africa in the 1700s might speak about slavery. However, we see, for example, I show in some of my work the ways in which, for example, what becomes the female fear factory is a long project of communicating certain forms of idea and permissibility, which then become institutionalized about women's bodies, about Black women's bodies, and so on, and what kinds of violence, and how these long systems, which are not simply clusters of ideas, but become institutionalized, and in fact, in many ways, become the very foundational knowledges in various disciplines in the academy, in the judiciary, in what we now understand as journalism, in canonization, in the locations of archives, what counts as an archive and what doesn't count as an archive, in fact, carry with them these long ideas about who matters and who does not matter, ideas which are not simply of our time, but ideas that continue to shape our time as part of the long shadow, as the long afterlives of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. As a post-colonialist, of course, I think that I benefit enormously from work that shows us the imbrication and intertwining, entanglement perhaps, of power and systems of knowledge. So, just a few really kind of basic examples, or have become basic because of the enormous work that has gone into teaching us these things. So, for example, in many African contexts, people are prone to speaking about how speaking about the project of colonialism as that of the Bible and the gun. As someone who's trained in English literature, of course, many post-colonialists, and in no small part, the late great Palestinian Edward Said, who was a literary scholar and a post-colonial theorist, shows us the ways in which English literature is an important part of how British colonialism becomes a success. So in ways that in fact illustrate the centrality of capturing the imagination, of training the imagination, of disciplining the imagination, and legitimizing certain forms of imaginative energy and making others impossible, as a project, in fact, of teaching literature. And so whereas we often think about culture and the imagination as something that arrives prior, or rather that exists prior or arrives after the moment of colonialism, in fact, part of the work that post-colonialists such as Said show us are the ways in which these systems of violence are not possible without violence. Sorry, without works of the imagination, without explicit works of the imagination, that many ways of knowing that we inherit and that we take for granted come as much through institutions such as the armed forces and the law as they do, in fact, through part of what we come to take for granted. Habiba Badaroun more recently speaks about how we are, each violent epoch trains us to see in certain ways. And when she says this, she's partly saying what John Berger has also said about, about how we trained into a certain visual imaginary. But she argues that a big part of how we think about land, how we think about landscape, how we think about who belongs where in South Africa, even when we exist in anti-colonial and anti-apartheid and anti-contestatory discourse and spaces, is also often very much moored, anchored in ideas that are fundamentally colonial. And so, so it seems to me then quite ironic that in many places, South Africa included, outside of people in performance and in performance studies and kind of performance theater, and explicitly the visual arts departments and art historians, we often think about the project of memory as though it is a word-based and body-based, and without thinking about the ways in which we're also trained, how it is also a visual socialization. So a kind of a training. And I think that when we don't pay attention to the ways in which we are socialized visually, imaginatively, in different kinds of kind of imaginative regimes, we often leave unattended to these kind of certain ideas around the memory, around archive, around imagination. My project then, I think, gain significantly from some of the people who remind us of this. And as you said, Nondumiso, when you're talking about, I love very much Gqoba's insistence that we pay attention to the question that art asks, because I think that continuing to sit with the question that art asks, which is not always a clear question, but the importance of examining the question that art asks allows us in many ways to think about how we know what we know, how we know what we know, what is knowable, and sit in the place of questioning rather than the place of resolution and understanding and reconciliation and in many ways closing off categories in the ways that many of us are trained to do in the academy. And so one of the questions that guides my work is to think about the enduring question, the enduring forms of knowledge that travel in the long shadow of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. And I think when I come up with the Female Fear Factory, in its very naming, of course, I understand, and I gain from historians of fear and other scholars of fear. Of course, we know that fear, even though it is a deeply felt emotion, personal, individual emotion, that fear is also very effectively a technology of domination, of rule. And so it is not an accident that, states of emergencies, that displacement, that terrorization and surveillance are absolutely crucial forms of the ongoing bombing of any who lay claim to prior ownership of space. We see it in Palestine. Currently, we see it in the Congo. We see it in the Sudan. And when I say currently, I don't mean as a new thing. And I think part, of course, of that terrorization is also the narrative that insists that we start with October 27th, so October 7th, right? Which, of course, we have to deny. But also, of course, this insistence, Ndashe speaks about it as passwords, that any claim, any comment, any solidarity, any legitimate rage expressed by those of us who have to be and choose to be in solidarity with Palestine always has to start with the rejection of, with the recognition of October 7th. And of course, that insistence and our refusal, that insistence is an attempt to enshrine fear. So when Ndashe speaks about these passwords, these kind of conditional, these ways in which dominant systems of power and dominant, existing empires insist that any language of solidarity, any language of critique be framed in these particular ways that begin by, in many ways, disowning part of what makes solidarity possible and necessary in the first place. Of course, Ndashe develops this notion of passwords in relation to apartheid South Africa and how we think about apartheid South Africa and how we think about what is post-apartheid South Africa. And so, of course, it makes sense that we would see it so prevalent in how globally we are expected to speak about Palestine, or how not to speak about Palestinian freedom and right to land. And of course, I speak about the Female Fear Factory specifically, initially in relation to gender-based violence, in relation to violence against women and queers. But of course, colonial subjects, those on the receiving end of genocide, understand very well the importance of the continued performance of violence, not only as eliminatory and in many ways and genocidal, but also as communicating constant threat that, as you outlined earlier on, becomes normalized terror and brutality. Part of what I'm hoping for in the conversation is an ongoing way of thinking about the ability to access that the imagination offers us, the ability to access very specific modes of knowledge, which are slightly out of view, of knowledge production and realms of possibility, what Carol Boyce Davis speaks about as a solidarity that is possible because of our migratory subjectivities. So the refusal to say, I can only speak about South Africa, to speak about South Africa imaginatively only illuminates South Africa. Of course, as someone who grew up in apartheid South Africa and who woke up one day after my 8th birthday to something that had suddenly become another country, which was not a country, the Ciskei, I'm often struck by the way in which one of the first countries to recognize, and one of the only countries to recognize South Africa was Israel. And so in many ways, Israel very proudly, same colors, same flag, same very. So not only so often when people even question the connections between South African apartheid, South African and Namibian apartheid, and Israeli apartheid are so obvious, so glaring, in material, not just imaginative ways, but in material and historical ways. I mean, it's not an accident that 1948. I mean, the parallels are quite remarkable. And in many ways, of course, we understand that these systems are about performing a certain kind of these systems offer factories for producing certain kinds of brutality, which are rehearsed over and over and over and over again, and refined and achieve enormous success at the level of at the level of kind of brutalizing and creating fear. But of course, also one of the things that a fear factory cannot do is completely dominate the imagination. While it takes up enormous spaces in the imagination, and it works through the imagination by normalizing terror through repetition, and so on. We understand, we know that there can be no total taking over of the imagination. And so, Ayman, sorry, can I just say one more thing? Am I running out of time?
Yes.
Ayman, I was very kind of animated to kind of see some of the work you're working with this archive that is not supposed to exist, that in many ways challenges what we think an archive does, and this kind of incredible idea of performing a trial, where a trial is such an important, limited in some instances, but such an important theater for the recognition of injustice, right? So if we look at history and which large-scale genocidal injustices merit a trial, right, in unquestionable ways, right? So not just kind of the evocation of justice as an idea, but the actual performance of justice in the institutionality that comes to us over many centuries of a particular kind of domination of Western European logic over the planet. But it's not. It seems to me particularly interesting that the format that these activists shape their solidarity into as a trial, because of course we didn't have a trial. Right? We didn't have a trial. We had a commission, and we exported this very interesting but also deeply flawed way of processing brutality to many other places in the world. And so I think the idea and the possibility of a trial of a trial that puts Israel on trial, because we're seeing it in the IJC, but also this kind of imaginative performance of it in your archive is in the archive that you work with is incredibly wonderful. And I think, of course, the conversation that you are having with this archive, because you're not just going to the archive, you're doing something with the archive and you're making us think about, you're creating a different kind of archive and you're asking us questions. I mean, I know Nondumiso asked you, what were some of the questions that you confronted? Seems to me, in addition to perhaps the questions that you were confronted as you were producing the work and encountering and entering and in conversation with this archive, is that you present us with several questions through this work around in fact the very heart of what needs questioning and what can be questioned, and the language of that questioning. And of course, again, this connection between archive and time, and what is recognized and what is a useful archive, and what that might mean. I'm going to stop, Nondumiso.
Yes, thank you.
But I have 50 things to say.
We're still here.
Didn't even read my presentation. Just wait.
Sometimes it's more, in the moment to just let yourself think right now. So thank you for that. And I think as you were speaking, both Ayman and I were having moments of recognition of certain things coming forward as well in our own minds. And I think that the question of imagination is absolutely central. And the fact that Ayman's work is dealing with this imaginative activism where it's done by ordinary people. And that's what Ayman asked, like, how did these ordinary people, this nurse, these ordinary people end up doing this work of going there, firstly, to witness, to work, and then come back to hold a tribunal and record it. It's absolutely gobsmacking for me. I want to just quickly go to a comment in the Q&A box by Masebeni Mac Matala, who says we can also rethink museums as spaces of possibilities for reimagining the archive. And yes, as far as they can adapt to intensification of the digital technologies, Maseveni, you are talking about another thinking dialogue that needs to happen. You say Johannesburg Contemporary Art Foundation suggests the co-evolution of the stillness of objects of art and movements of subjectivities through its architecture and connectivity of the electronic. And I think yesterday's conversation spoke quite a bit about architecture and museums and reimagining in some significant ways. I'll introduce Nur Abed's work, Our Songs Were Ready for All Wars to Come. And the ordinariness of the title in itself speaks quite powerfully. Our Songs Were Ready for All Wars to Come is a 22-minute film of which we'll watch an excerpt. It is choreographed scenes based on documented folk tales from Palestine. It begins with 4 minutes of darkness and the haunting sound of a woman's voice. The perforated edge of the film, occasionally silhouetted by flashes of light, highlights the nature of this work as a mediated document. Images of women performing draw connections between latent stories of water wells and communal rituals associated with disappearance. Rituals around mourning and death. The only narration in this film is a song, which is sung by Palestinian singer Maya Khaldi. Its lyrics are a collage of different folk tales. This film explores the critical stance of folklore as a source of knowledge and its possible connection to alternative social and representational models in Palestine. Nur Abed asks, how can folklore become a common emancipatory tool for people to overturn dominant discourses and reclaim their history and land and rewrite reality as they know it? And I think, as Maseveni was asking as well, to reimagine. And I'd like to encourage you all to please write responses as we continue to speak. You are more than welcome to share your thoughts and join us as we think in dialogue. I'm going to ask Prof. Gqola if you could please share your brief response as we take the conversation forward into what artistic knowing helps us to do.
Thank you, Nondumiso. I think just watching that, first of all, thank you for that incredibly powerful just piece of work that really engages all our senses, and kind of access sensuous knowledge in the way that Mina Salami speaks about it. Not sensual, but knowledge that comes from the senses. So that haunting music at the beginning that moves throughout the short film into sometimes moments of playfulness and dancing and joy. And so even the music, very unsettling, heartbreaking, haunting, clearly some kind of mourning and remembering. So that haunting, an invitation to memory, but also an invitation to life and play and possibility and full humanity, even in the midst of catastrophe, right? That the crawling woman figures, they're crawling despite the harshness of the holes and the stairs and it very uncomfortable, very difficult, but nonetheless because the move. So for me, the movement of the body and the soundscape of this film can work really incredibly well together. I'm also really energized and kind of provoked. I'm not quite sure if I'm still going to think about it a bit more. The way in which the film makes us aware of its own construction, right? So the frame is the jump cuts and the kind of burning. I don't know what the technical language escapes me now, but the framing of the frames are visible, and the frame is in construction and falling apart and burning, and so the sense of this reminder of the film's kind of constructedness. It's a friend of mine recently sent me, I forgot the name of the poem, I'm going to look at it up quickly, sent me Mahmoud Darwish's What is Lost. And one of the things that, and it's also, again, such a sensuous, not sensual, I have to keep saying not sensual, because I know every time you say sensuous, people think sensual. Again, there, memory and the body and the smell and okay, we can't quite smell Moore's film, but I feel like apart from although we can, perhaps we can imagine what it smells like, as it looks like something we may have seen, but also the ways in which, for example, he speaks about it called to mind that poem for me as well. That it's a very beautiful, it's a technically very sophisticated film, but this calling to mind its own textuality
Yes, I think I want
Its own
to
constructedness and its yes. So the
mm,
frame, but also the so kind of the side frames. I'm sorry, I do know the technical language, but I cannot. My brain this afternoon is a bit frazzled, but um, but also the kind of papyrus-like kind of horizontal frame. So I'm thinking through the connections between what the different sounds and the different movements of the body and our invitation to think about Noor's invitation to think about the short film as to the fact that she doesn't allow us to forget that we're watching a short film, even as it invites us to temporarily forget that we're watching a film and we're so drawn into the world of the yeah. So those are my initial thoughts.
yes. And I think there was something about this idea that Noor wants us to engage with this film as a document, as a mediated document that's making a comment about archive work and is making a comment about textuality and the flatness of it and the ways that it can be flattening of stories of people and there's something incredible about how you were talking earlier about the project of memory as visual socialization and that we often leave unattended certain ideas around memory and imagination, and we take for granted that the things that we remember and imagine are coming or emerging on their own, but that in fact we have been taught how to see and trained how to know, and that determines how we think what matters, and that determines what is possible for us to imagine. And when yesterday Prof. Vergès was talking about the pedagogy of unlearning, there's something about this film that in its continuing to show us that we are watching a mediated document is asking us to keep checking how we are seeing. And so we're not just consuming the image and just kind of following a thread, but we're reminded that we are engaging with something that is in conversation with a particular archive. And to watch these people crawl up, because it really is, it's in a ritual of mourning, but it also just now reminded me so strongly of William Pope Al's work, which is called this Crawling series. And I know that I think it was Andre Lepere who contextualized William Pope's work in the Crawling series as being intimate with Fanon's way of knowing what the experience of being in a state of have-notness is. So not just a state of not having, but a state of have-notness. So a state where you are forced to not have, right? And so that kind of play with the words does that thing. And here where we're dealing with people who are gone, and it's this space where there's holes in the ground and people disappear, and the people who are there are crawling, and then they have to do the work of mourning and cooking and continuing to live and dance. And so it goes into this kind of everydayness of the catastrophe, which I think Ayman works with so well. Ayman, your response, please.
Well, I mean, no, I just I was thinking about it now and I found it very interesting because there is something like common, like when I looked even to my archive about I mean, because kind of like now in this catastrophic moment that there is a genocide that's taking place, that inside this genocide, there is like a small genocide that's taking place, which is basically, it's like, like, for example, like in Gaza now, I mean, the archive is completely burned. Like the whole archive Gaza city, it's completely burned. All culture institution and art institution is completely destroyed. And this is a story was happening in 82, where the Israeli destroyed the Palestinian study institution and stole everything from there. And like, so like, and then like it comes here is the film where like it kind of remind you like this is like the way of Palestinian keeping their own things, just like like it's, as you said, now is just like like we get into the hole and just like we kind of like recover again and just like make it again and again, which is it's kind of interesting. Like from the 48 until now, Israel like worked systematically to delete our history, like basically the culture and the narrative and the dance and like everything, even the food, like they just take it and it's become not Palestinians. So, and I think this is one of the things that we need to always like remind ourselves of it, and just like how we wake up in the morning and do our works and just like keep kind of like have it with us and not forget it. And this is one of the interesting things, like the dance, the body movement, and just like like as you said, like they just like into this hole and just go back and do the works and make the food, which is it's like what's going in Gaza now. After this catastrophe, people need to wake up in the morning and just make their foods. They need to go to works even and just like come back, even though there is nothing left in Gaza. But also this idea of like destroying the Palestinian archive and the Palestinian heritage, it's kind of like from 48 till now, it's kind of like systematically being there. And this is what's happening in Gaza. And I remember that even in 2002, when I was in Ramallah working in the TV channel, and that's like was when the Israeli re-invade the West Bank. And I remember they did kind of the same, where I was working in the TV channels, they just reoccupied the TV channels or like enter it and stole everything, like nothing left. And I think like it's something there that these people, I mean, they need to delete this. I mean, they need to delete it. And this is like our work to keep imagining even the past and just reproduce it
Yes.
to the futures, and just like redo
Yes.
it again and redo it again, and not. And this is why I think the importance of the archive to not be hidden in anywhere. It just need to be like there, just like we need to just
It can
keep
be
it.
used.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of what's also imaginatively exciting about this work is also the ways in which Noor takes the folk tales and creates a song out of it. And so that haunting sound is a folk tale that's being transmitted through that frequency to us, so that it does not die, so that it can haunt us. And there's such magnificent, gentle interventions that are being made with memory and archive and documentation, that I think in the space of coming to imagining in emergency is absolutely critical, to keep finding these ways of transmitting what's being deleted. How else can it be transmitted so that the frequencies filter through? And I'm going to just go to our Q&A section. And Masebeni writes tactility, and thank you for the film. And Leora Faber writes, it is so poignant to be watching Noor's hauntingly powerful work tonight on the second night of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And Sheree Halley says, I found comfort in the sounds or songs, like a call to prayer or a call to war, or both, I think, as well, Sheree, which is what I find exciting about artistic ways of knowing, that it's not always about an either or, this kind of colonial dichotomization, but both those things can exist. Sheree continues to say, I was reminded of Hiba Abu Nada's words from her poem Seven Skies for the Homeland, where she writes, it gifted us its tune and gave up all the singing. Yet here in this film, I do find comfort in these songs that were ready for all wars to come. And even that, right, that title is energizing. It's it's saying these songs will have you prepared. Remember this rhythm, and you will know that you have something when the next war comes, which again is catastrophe. Ironically, that it's from a folk tale, Shere says, no wonder I hold a space of comfort right here, right now. Lauren Sukul says, seeing these two Islamic women jumping with and around one another, I'm thinking about the idea that politics and political theory may easily slip into becoming all thought and no action. Yes, political theory is mediated through the word action. As a dancer, I'm reading about how the dancer offers an embodied knowledge of the mobilization that politics require. This extends to the performer in general, but there is something about the dance, by nature, escaping textual description, and carries deep symbolic meaning and actual action. And Lauren gives us Susan Foster, Randy Martin, and Andre Lepere as references to continue thinking. And I think that's quite significant as well. The song and the rhythm and the call to movement makes me think of Bayo Komolafe's idea of danceability, that in activism work, and I think it reminds me of kind of Tony Cade Bambara's call to the revolution. I can't remember what it says exactly. Pumla, do you remember the idea that the revolution must somehow be inviting, to paraphrase, and that there's a danceability to these sounds, to these rhythms, so we can keep moving. We can keep moving, even if it's crawling, even if we're flattened by the have-notness. We're going to go to our last stimulus, and that's Gerald Machona's Fagfakure. If you can please cue that up for us, Sinead. And Gerald Machona's Fagfakure, or People from Far Away, uses decommissioned Zimbabwean dollars and decommissioned old South African rands as an aesthetic material that signifies the forced economic migration of Zimbabwean migrants into neighboring SADC countries and abroad. While South Africa hosts the largest population of these Zimbabwean nationals living in the diaspora, there's a growing need in the post-colony to deconstruct notions of individual and collective identity, for nations, nationalisms, and citizenry can no longer be defined through indigeneity or territory. The performance video works from the premise that forms of cultural mediation, such as visual and performance art, can offer insights and potential resistance to the intolerance, misconceptions, and social trauma associated with Afrophobia. Nyao, a masked masquerade originating in Malawi, which Machona subtly references in much of his work, is here a potentially subversive form of performance that was used by the Chewa people while living as foreigners in Zimbabwe and other diasporas. Using this masquerade performance becomes a signifier of Chewa-ness for those who sometimes face Afrophobic name-calling, such as Mapfakure, people from far away. I'm thinking about Lawrence Sekole's questioning of political theory and the mediation through languages of action differently to physical action, and how that, you know, speaks back to your questions around solidarity as well, Ayman, rethinking what that means when we have so much language about action taking place, and the ways in which that somehow, as Lauren I think is saying, seems to immobilize us from actual movement, actual embodied doing. And then we come to Gerald Machona. And I'm going to read Surafel Abebe's question. And Pumla, this one comes to you, who asks, how can we relate the fear factory to embodied epistemic genocide, the killing of lives, memories, and imagination? How can we remobilize radical intellectual traditions? While the vogue in academia, what one would call the turns, are forcing us to leave imaginative languages of freedom behind. So for instance, what do we want to keep in the tension between the idea of the post-racial and long-standing, or as Professor Gqola captures in the triad with slavery, colonialism, and apartheid? So how can we relate the fear factory to embodied and epistemic genocide, the killing of lives, of memories, and imagination? How do we remobilize radical intellectual traditions? And I'd like to come to you, Prof. Gqola, from Gerald Machona's wonderfully danceable subversive work, which for me is so parallel in particular ways with Noah Arpert's work, which puts the danceability into an everyday living, and everyday continuing to be free, to continue to embody freedom within absolute crisis. Prof. Gqola?
First of all, thank you for that second film. I'm quite challenged by the juxtaposition and how the juxtaposition. And it strikes me, I'm coming to the question. It strikes me, which it should have struck me watching Noor's film much more strongly. In retrospect, I think. But it strikes me that both films, of course, embodiment and imagination, highly intertextual, but also very much a commentary on settlement and land and all of those registers of space and ownership. So many of the processes we're talking about, of course, are not free
and
flowing.
Even if I can jump in, yes, even economies of fear factories. The use of currency is such a wildly ironic way to really talk about this continuation of secularism. Yes, continue.
Is it ironic?
In a way.
Because I mean, the whole point of the reason it's called the female fear factory is also not just highlight the fear aspect, but to also speak about it as a phenomenon of a very particular time in human history, right? So the emergence, we know how the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism comes about. It comes up, and and the marrying of those processes and kind of colonial processes epistemically and in material ways. And so all of those processes are technologies of displacement, of knowledge making, of space taking, of genocide that are from a very particular time in human history, right? That are inaugurated at a very particular time. And so when I'm thinking about the female, I mean, I because I'm a scholar of slavery in my previous life, in my other life, I'm still kind of a scholar of slavery, but I haven't produced much scholarship on slavery in a while. But I'm always, of course, thinking about the forms of knowledge and the forms of training. And so factory, literally, I'm thinking about all the literature that teaches us, that shows us how those first factories were put in place, not just as buildings, but the ways in which they inaugurate a different way of taking up space, of training bodies, of killing bodies, of a certain way of thinking, many of which we don't think about as related to capitalism and colonialism at all. So also an attempt to render some of those possible. And in fact, the factory, but let me go back to the land thing quickly before I forget, because the factory thing I won't forget. You know, kind of thinking about both these films next to each other, juxtaposed, also made me think about the way in which, so we're talking about haunting in relation to Noir's film, and Noir, and haunting as a call to the, not just a call to the imagination, but also as a refusal of the claim that we can be erased, right? In many ways, the haunting, because the erasure and the settlement and the genocide are about creating empty space, about creating, I mean, the alienation is about creating free land, emptiness. So we start from nothing. There can be no Palestinian civilization. There can be no Palestinian art. There can be no Palestinian memory. There can be no South African or Namibian or, you know, whatever memory land, and you know, and so on. But of course, we know that the idea of free land, as Arij Khoury reminds us in her fantastic new book, Colonizing Palestine, that free land is a big part of the imagination. Something along the line of, you know, free land is so only in the imagination of the settler, who with greater power can ignore the material rights and desires. And both these films in many ways are not allowing us to forget the desires, the fighting, the survival, and indeed the very humanity of you know, people, the untidiness, but also the beauty and the love and the magic and the dancing and the survival and the holes, instead of creating absence. Hence the haunting. Instead of creating absence, they haunt us, and the haunting reminds us also, or doesn't remind us because we don't forget, but keeps in memory the attempt to create nothing and to create free land and to create absence. And so in many ways, the haunting and all of those holes that we see, and the dancing around, and the cheeky kind of dancing around and going through different portals. I mean, I was a sci-fi geek as a teenager and as a child. And so, you know, I know it's Afrofuturist, but in my mind, it was initially very sci-fi, the kind of movement from one minute he was in a desert and with that resonant flag, the next minute he was in I don't know what town, but it looks like one of those Eastern Cape or Free State towns. So it could be Makanda, it could be, you know, and so that kind of movement between space, which in many ways I think is also kind of an apt metaphor for thinking about the imagination, right? That you can move from desert emptiness and this kind of desire to plant a flag and do these things and find yourself in a completely different place, because in many ways the imagination is not hamstrung necessarily by the kind of technology of fear. So even we're not free of it, we are not completely contained by it. And then I feel like I've already talked too long.
Yes,
I'm going to stop, but I'm going to come back to Surafel Abebe's question again, because I feel like I haven't really, and I think both such big, important questions.
Wonderful questions. Yes. And I think part of what I find also exciting about these two works at the same time is how they trouble temporality. So even the movement of from here to there is not about in the past it was a desert, and now we are in the everyday world that we recognize, but that it's a simultaneous space, and it's the experience of being in this world and being seen as so other that you are isolated from everyone else and you can't belong within this world is a kind of desert experience. But at the same time, there's, you know, a dance that comes from those who are called foreign and are told they do not belong. And that dance is exactly what keeps reminding us that we have been the ones who've been called foreign and don't belong and have been, have our movement restricted in so many particular ways. And it's such fascinating work, and to see them next to each other, I found really interesting. So Ayman, I'd like to come to you to talk about seeing Gerald Machona's work, and then we're going to complete with the questions that are in our Q&A box. Ayman.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I need to see it again and again, because like just one time it's just like it's not easy to. But there was like I agree with this idea of the ownership. I mean, this kind of like how the film started. It's just like it reminds me of the story of like the settler in Palestine, how they kind of like comes and take the land, and just like it's become them, or like they own it in a way, but by raising the flag, even kind of like the same kind of method. And then it's like they cut you out of it, and they just like make everything is impossible for the original people to do anything. So they become poor and poor and poor. And then they just like come to make you work for them. So like, because like, as you said, like, like there is no way to go anywhere. Like there is like restrictions everywhere. It's like, you're not allowed to do this. You're not, I mean, which is, it's really fascinating idea of how he did it in this way. It's kind of like remind me of this story. I mean, like this, how they kind of like managed to kind of thought of it like as a free land, like without anyone, and they want to get you out of it, and how they work into this kind of way. It's really fascinating. As I said, like, but this film is like really kind of like it need to look at it again and again,
Yes.
kind of get it.
Yes.
Because like the language, it was very, very nice, how he made it, like like how he kind of like work it together. But yeah, I just like was like, yeah, it's just like this is the story of like the settler in Palestine. They come, they own the place, they just like cut you out of it, and then like you work for them, and then like you just use their own money to buy their own stuff, which is it's originally yours, it's not them. And then like it's kind of like repeat itself in a way. It's just like it's amazing. It's really amazing.
And I think for me as well, seeing these works next to each other is also about those connections that you were talking about in your archive, that people are able to see these experiences as interconnected and using the same rhetorics and creating the same kind of experiences of embodiment and alienness and otherness, and the call to find other ways for us to make these connections, to see how we are moving within these systems of domination in such similar ways. I mean, Gerald Machona's work is looking at Afrophobia, at an experience of coming to South Africa, which is post-apartheid, and the work resonates so strongly with an experience of settler colonization, and that's part of the work of using that currency for him as well, was saying that we're continuing these economies, that the factory is still churning out the money that is now useless paper, and we're still in a strange kind of affective economy. I think Sarah Ahmed uses those kinds of terms of affective economies, and so the experience of colonization is one we can know. We can actually say that we recognize this. And so what does that then ask us to do? What is the responsibility there from us to not just be part of South Africa and look at the strange other trying to purchase water at Pick and Pay? That it's such a fascinating thing to be challenged by. And I don't have any answers. So I'm going to ask you, Ayman and Pumla, to respond to the questions that are left in our Q&A box by way of conclusion. So let's come back to Serapil's questions. How can we relate the fear factory to embodied and epistemic genocide, the killing of lives, memories, and imagination? How can we remobilize radical intellectual traditions? And I think that is, yeah, how I'll hold that one.
So, I mean, I think that I'm not sure how to answer this question directly. So I'll come at it obliquely, because the female fear factory comes, it is shaped by thinking about genocidal violence, femicidal violence, about emptying of space and claims that women do not belong in certain spaces, that is legitimized, and it comes with certain, but also the understanding that, of course, not all women or queer people or gender ambiguous people. I'm using gender ambiguous not as my terminology, but as the terminology of kind of patriarchy. But this kind of sense of being legitimately out of place and being legitimately emptyable and displaceable. And so, how do we have to relate it to those questions, because these are precisely the questions that I'm trying to come to terms with as I come to the female fear factory. I don't think I would have been able to come to the female fear factory had I not been thinking about displacement and genocide and slavery and apartheid and the very, one of my arguments, well, I think it's more than an argument at this point. I've kind of belabored, I've tried to show it with several others in many cases, the ways in which sexual violence is at the very heart of white supremacy, right? So that racism is made through sexual violence. And so any genocidal violence is in our times, it's definitely white supremacist. And so how do we relate sorry, I'm reading the question now because I think you've answered the question because the question's disappeared. Okay.
Yes.
But I took a picture of it so that I wouldn't completely forget it. It is embodied. It is a technology of embodied and epistemic, as well as kind of femicidal, genocidal kind of violence, killing of memories and imagination. And in fact, part of the project of writing against the female fear factories, which is my project, so I diagnose it only in order to be able to write against it. There's a very kind of deliberate reason why I go to works of the imagination to help me think about how we might undo and unmake the female fear factory, because I don't think that resorting to colonial knowledge or kind of factory logic is going to take us, is going to allow us to unlearn the fluencies of the female fear factory. And then how can we, I love the second question, and I have an easy question, which is a very unsatisfactory answer, but it's the only answer I have. I think that we have to resist the vogue, understanding, of course, that the increasingly vogue logics and very vogue traditions in the academy do not exist outside of the corporatization of the academy globally, do not exist outside of neoliberal. So it's not an accident that the academy is under attack in the ways that it is, any more than the judiciary in some countries, such as ours, is attacked at the time that it is, that those institutions that are about thinking, about, that hold enormous power, but offer different structures of thinking, are also trapped increasingly now in the pressure of kind of fashionable schools of thought. I think the way in which we remobilize radical intellectual traditions by holding on to them and not being swept away by the idea of what is in vogue in academia, the turns. And if we find some value in the terms, fine, we make use of them. But I think it's important that because of course the logic of a neoliberal academy, the logic of a corporatized academy, and this is basically the state of the academy, the fight in defense of the academy across the globe. There isn't any place in the world where there isn't concerted effort to corporatize it more and more. But I think those of us who think that there's a place for different traditions of thinking are certainly not necessarily powerless in this regard. I think that the work of the imagination and intellectual work has a crucial role in understanding and unthinking these kind of structures of violence. I mean, we also know that historically the academy is what legitimized many of the central colonial underpinnings and central kind of misogynist, patriarchal, Zionist, white supremacist underpinnings. History tells us this very clearly. And so we have to continue the work and in the tradition of contesting those and creating in freeing ways and in freedom loving and freedom affirming ways. So
thank you.
So then we refuse the force. You said they force us to leave imaginative language of freedom behind. We can refuse that.
Yes.
We have to refuse that.
Yes. And I think there's such magnificent kinds of refusals in the works that we have been talking about today. Ayman's work, and starting with these people who refuse that there is no justice and hold a tribunal, and then this archive that refuses to be erased and finds its way out, and Ayman who refuses for it to be institutionalized and wants it to be accessed by people who will actually use it. I think those are the kinds of things that can remind us also that radical imagination is alive, and we can refuse to believe that it is gone, and to see how people are using it, and perhaps that also can energize us in other ways, to see what are the ways that people are using radical imagination. So I'm going to read quickly. Masiveni says, the traveling nature of archive demands that we clean them of their dirty histories. We need to stop at the originary objects of history and reveal the myths that they conceal. Lauren Sukul says, also on the topic of haunting, that no longer planted gold-sprayed protea flower made of decommissioned money is removed from the ecosystem. There's so many removals that are in that work, and watered, but with a drop of shop-bought, and I would add acidic water, a haunting image. There's just so much layered in there. And Surafel concludes by saying, thank you very much. I think that's directly for you, Prof. Gqola. That was extremely insightful. Ayman AlAzraq, I'd like to conclude by asking you for a few words. What, in terms of thinking and imagining and imagination in emergency, is energized for you here today? Because when we first spoke, you said that you don't know how to speak about Palestine anymore. It's become so difficult. And I'm wondering if anything has sparked some new access to freedom.
No, I mean, I totally agree with what you last things say about refuse the language that they want us to use, basically, and then use our language in terms of Palestine or any other conflict. And this is how we kind of keep it going on, by not accepting the way that they want us to talk about it, which is the way of we are the victims and they are the one that they save us, and that's like we need to be thankful for that. We need to refuse that, and we need to say that in a clear way. You know, as the archive itself, it said that, like, you know, like this group of people refused, like, you know, like this idea of no justice, and they want to take it out of everywhere, like, you know, like they want to do it themselves, and just like they refuse to keep this archive somewhere to preserve it. So the archives come to us and told us, like, come on guys, do something with it, and then we need to give it to other people, say like, do something with it. And by refusing that, it's itself, it tells like the story of it. I mean, of course, like after 7th of October, I said that it's like, especially in Europe, I mean, everything has become more complicated, or they want to make it complicated. It's not complicated, it's like very clear, but they want, you know, like suddenly all the museums like Norway, they don't want to talk engaged in political discussion about Palestine. You know, it's, as they said, it's more complicated, so they don't know how to deal with that. So, you know, like, but by refusing to accept that and just keep doing what we're doing, it's just like you kind of like putting them in the pressures of like, okay guys, we will do, I mean, we don't need the museum, I mean, we can make our own museum, our own like way of like showing our history, our stories, our like things. We don't need that.
Yes, yes. And I'm reminded by, in the recent radical ad-lib, Dineo writes about Helen Sibidi's work and her refusal to be institutionalized in and to be valued by institutional terms. And that refusal is an indigenous affirmation. It's a way to affirm what we know and how we do things, and that the institutions or the museums, these architectures, these technologies of oppression are not the only way that we can live. And so refusal affirms our freedom. Pumla, last words to conclude.
I don't even know that I have anything else to add. This has been so wonderful. I know we've come to the end, but there's a part of me that's almost not wanting it to end. So all I'm going to say is thank you very much, Ayman, for your work,
Thank you
and
very
thank you
much.
so
That was
much.
really, really nice listening to you. I mean, it was very, it's my pleasure to listen to you. I mean, it was really.
Thank you. Likewise. And thank you so much, Nondumiso, for, you know, for holding this so much and being so, and all of your incredible kind of provocations and thinking with us and invitations, and holding this space and not just holding the space, making the space so magical, even as we're talking about such rage-inducing times. You know, I think in many ways, the way in which you've shaped this space. And I know you don't want me to talk about you. That's why you present making us all talk about our own work. So, but this is what happens when you allow people, ungovernable people to to speak. That in many ways, I mean, it's just your generosity and the beauty with which you've kind of created and shaped this space, even as we're talking about such about catastrophe and emergency and genocide and erasure and haunting. And I think in many ways illuminating exactly why we have so much hope why we have so much hope and love and investment in the imagination, and why the imagination is so life, not just life sustaining, but life giving and world changing. That you know, yeah. So thank you. And thank you, Ayman. And that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you very much, Professor Pumla, Dineo Gqola. Thank you so much, Ayman AlAzraq. And thank you very much to every single one of you that has stayed with us and gathered with us. And I hope that you are also energized toward making space for yourself to imagine and continue finding other ways of energizing freedom. That's all from us. Thank you.